cigarette.
True Detective is an amazing show. It's definitely one of my favorite shows I've ever seen. I especially enjoy the theme of ignorance versus introspection, embodied by Marty versus Cole's outlook on life. There's a lot of interchange between these two characters. They both have daughters, and let's just say shaky relationships with their wives. Cole, however, is extremely noble in his purposes on Earth because he's only really alive at this point because he wants to participate in the battle of good versus evil. And he's extremely competent at it, which makes him so likable. Not relatable, but likable. What I'm meaning to talk about is this broader theme of ignorance versus introspection. We see it a lot embodied in these characters, and it's hard to separate it because Marty is the iconic religious born middle class football high school star type of jock kind of character, whereas Cole is traumatized and in a lot of ways been forced to look inwards because after the death of his daughter, I think that he had to come to a reason to keep living. And you know, when you lose a loved one like that, you have to start asking questions related to your mortality. The thing that the writers did that is subtle, but it definitely shows that they're supporting the introspection side of the debate, is that they made Cole super competent and likable, whereas Marty has so many scenes where he's just like the most terrible person, someone that you would hate to have as your own father. And I see my own father in him a little bit. And it comes from that emotional neglect that people sometimes fall into, where the lack of introspection, it makes it so that your older trauma kind of kicks in and it starts guiding your life somewhere where you never really expected it to go. Like in one scene, for example, Marty, it does say like, you sometimes don't even know where you are in life. But Rust also isn't perfect. There is this huge side of him that is just completely nihilistic, and it blocks him from a lot of the love and compassion that he could receive from others. The reason that he's stuck in this loop of nihilism is because he hasn't really healed from the trauma of his daughter. And grief is not something that you really ever get rid of. It is long-term. Mourning happens for your entire life. And Cole must take a page from Buddhist teachings in that you must have some radical acceptance of your situation, of your life, because this accident of Sophia, his daughter, was completely out of his locus of control. But when faced with that, instead of accepting it, he's pushed back into a very nihilistic and very negative point of view. But the reason he's still so likable because he takes all that energy and does something with it. One of my favorite scenes is when Cole is preparing to infiltrate this biker gang that he was previously part of. So he knew that things were about to get real. And the way that he talks to Marty, saying, oh, the stakes aren't that high anyways. If I get found, I take a bullet to the head. Then going into a super gory story about cartels and torture. Super edgy, but Cole just makes it work. Like, it doesn't come off as cringy. Like, Matthew McConaughey is the perfect actor for this role. He's so cool. And the bike gang is named Iron Crusaders, if you're interested. And in the present, Marty talks about how the answer was under my nose, but looking at all the wrong clues, saying it's the detective's curse. In perspective of the writers, this is really nice little nod off to the fact that Marty's core problem is his lack of introspection, his lack of philosophizing. But as a person, if this was someone I knew who said this, I would be so pissed because it's far too little too late. But the character of Marty isn't one-dimensional either. In one really fast scene, we see that his father died a year before they started this investigation. That definitely doesn't excuse all of his scummy behavior, but it's just something that I noticed, and it was one line of dialogue within the entire show. And he brings it up when Maggie found out that he had his affair. So that also is really scummy that he brings it up then for the only time. That's another thing I really like about good shows, is that they don't really fester on any of the boring stuff. Like, we didn't see Marty and Cole meeting for the first time and then having to go slowly into ramping up their relationship. No, it started off really fast with Dora Lang's death and then going straight into the investigation. Another aspect of the series is that Cole does become a vigilante, but the show is very obvious about its perspective on this. He wins at the end. Vigilantism is verified as being good in the show. So be a vigilante. I mean, I don't think anyone would disagree that Cole shouldn't have tracked down Reggie Ledoux, the Wall, and Errol. It's just funny. He steals cocaine from the police officer's locker, and Marty barely questions it. That is one thing about Marty, is he is around for the long term. This guy does dive headfirst into that light versus dark battle, and he is on the light side every single time. One of my favorite scenes of the entire series is when Marty has the opportunity to leave, and Cole's telling him straight up in little words, but between the lines, he says, "You can leave," and Marty denies it. He says, "I'm not going to let you go in there without me." And it shows Marty isn't a bad guy at its core. A lot of people know this about people like Marty, but there are some people who have really strong emotional cores and who are good people in the moment. But in the long term, Marty does just absolutely ruin his family's life because of his own innate desires and wanting to have sex with younger women and all these really, really short lasting things. But it's also really easy to feel bad for Marty, especially when we see him near the latter half of the series where he is suffering the consequences of his actions. He's divorced. He's living in a single room apartment. And there's this one scene where the camera is slowly panning with this music playing. And we just see him eating this very lonely and sad TV dinner. I can't. That scene makes me feel so much empathy for him, even though that it's like the consequences of his own actions. Because Marty is a good person, but he just doesn't really know how to express that and doesn't really understand why he keeps falling into his own patterns. And it takes a lot of insight to be able to do that. And, you know, he has the detective's curse, quote unquote, because he can't see what's really in front of him. All of his problems stem from inside. And all of Cole's problems stem from inside too. But the difference is Cole is obsessed with looking inwards. He is on the opposite side of the spectrum. And it makes him a better person. It makes him more competent. It makes him question reality. And I think that is one of the core theses of True Detective, is that introspection versus ignorance. Marty, unfortunately, never has an arc in the series. He doesn't ever change. He doesn't become more vulnerable with other people. You know, at the end of it, when he's in a coma and he wakes up, there is a moment where the emotions are just too strong and he breaks out into tears in front of his family. But that's not really being vulnerable. He's vulnerable in that moment, but he's not doing it on purpose. That is just another consequence of his actions of not knowing how to express his feelings and having it just burst out suddenly. On the other hand, Cole has gone through an entire arc in like 10 minutes because at the end of the series, he's encountered a spiritual experience which makes him break out of his nihilism almost like instantly. On paper, this sounds really bad, but Matthew McConaughey just plays this role perfectly. I can imagine a worse actor trying to play this role and feeling so weird because he gets into a coma and bam, he's changed. And that is a very sudden thing to happen, but it's believable because he has been wanting to have this spiritual experience throughout the entire series. Not explicitly, but we see him having hallucinations of his daughter, and retracing the murder of Dora Lang and trying to get to the bottom of it is an extension of his grief. The only reason he's participating in this investigation is because he's been triggered by the death of his daughter, and instead of crumbling, he takes that energy and puts it towards solving homicides. Something that is extremely beneficial to society, something that it takes almost a bad person to do, but that's a whole different topic. This requirement for bad people. I think the show is definitely peddling it is required, but that's a very like interesting philosophical question, because how else do you stop horrible people? Is it by stooping down to their level but maintaining a pure heart? You know, he is a vigilante. That's the reason why I think the show would probably take a positive perspective on this. Like, the world needs bad people. I think Cole says it himself. But anyways, I think that is honestly, that could take a whole video to explain. So once he finds Errol and kills him, there is this coma event that reawakens in him a very spiritual side that he was lacking throughout the entire series through the extension of his nihilism. And that's really human, because you have to be an investigator of reality, just being a human. And doing that, you kind of fall away from spirituality, because there is no rational explanation that can be put onto a spiritual event. And if you haven't had one, then you wouldn't understand the cognitive dissonance that it creates. And it honestly opens up a lot of things. And it opens up the compassionate side of your soul. I mean, Cole even says at the end that love is the answer. Compassion's the answer. It's all around us. It doesn't need to be rationalized. It is the answer. Along with the battle of good versus evil, Cole has a much more optimistic perspective on it, looking at the stars and saying, it looks like the light's winning. You know, I could easily imagine that earlier in the series, he would say something completely opposite. And it's interesting that Cole has had a spiritual side throughout the entire show. Reggie Ledoux in the script version of episode 5 actually calls him Little Priest. And then there's that scene with the wall saying, I see the black around your eyes, and that you have a devil, little man. There's also the many moments where he hallucinates and tastes the rust in the air and all that kind of stuff that points towards a more spiritual side, yet he rationalizes it as the synapses in his brain being crossed. But it doesn't really fully explain the timing of these things, especially when they find Errol's house. Like, he instantly knows that this is the place, because he starts having the taste of aluminum like he had earlier in the show when he was close to Dora Lang's dead body. That kind of thing shows that this isn't just a crossing of brain synapses. It's more spiritual, but it's interesting that he denies it. And then the climax and ultimate conclusion of his character is him accepting his spirituality. Not through any religion, because we know what he thinks about religion, but it's more of a intangible spiritual attachment and feeling that he expresses through Sophia especially. There's also the scenes where he's raiding the farm and cult building that is on Errol's property, where Errol is like talking to him, but he's walking through. There's no way that Cole should be hearing Errol, and it's impossible, but in the actual events of the story, he is hearing Errol as if he's an omnipresent being. But in the end, both characters are driven by pure intentions. Like, Marty is driven by pure intentions because he quits his job after seeing dead babies. Like, he has this very emotional reaction to the suffering of innocent people. And especially in this show, if you look at who is harming children, that's a great compass in this narrative to find out who is the good and who is the bad guy. For example, Errol and his cult, obviously pure evil. Cole, obviously really good, because that's his only drive in life. And Marty is a bit of both, because he is unintentionally hurting his children, and he also slaps his kid at one point. And the symbol of the decrepit crown that is left on the tree branch, which represents the failing relationship between him and his children. Like, there's a lot of reasons to dislike Marty, and the impact to his family from his own actions is huge. It's the main reason. But at least he's not killing kids, and he's also putting a lot of energy into solving Dora Lang's murder, and he has a heart of gold. We know this. It's just interesting, like, you are responsible for your own emotions, and at a certain point, there is consequences to not having introspection. And it's a really brave thing to look inwards, to do introspection. And it's also really easy to fall into nihilism. But yeah, I think True Detective is a really interesting show. And I love the fact that ignorance versus introspection is one of the core features of it. Because personally, I know my dad is a lot like Marty because he's from a different generation. I'm sure a lot of people have the same thing. It's nice having this media so that I don't feel as alone. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe. I'll see you next time. Peace. Bye, 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 bye.